Hi folks, today I'd like to talk about Article 12 that deals with our national debt. There may be no better indicator of the failure in our country over the last 100 years than the amount of debt that's been required just to maintain our marginal existence. And even though you've had to pay ever-increasing amounts of taxes during this time, the failed outcomes of the policies being implemented in our country are so bad that those taxes don't even come close to covering the cost of them. And it requires more debt every year to try to hide these failures. And without this debt, the pain and suffering created by these policies would already be too much to bear. But this debt helps ease the pain. Think of it like the morphine they use in hospice. It doesn't cure anything, it doesn't fix anything, but it does provide comfort until the end. Here's Article 12. We reject the notion of unlimited government spending that's led to a $34 trillion national debt. This spending overreach is used by incompetent politicians to hide the failed outcomes of their policies, to buy the votes needed to maintain power, and to bankrupt the middle class while they enrich themselves and their political allies. We support a 7-year plan to reduce government spending until a balanced budget is attained. So let's start with what is the national debt? The national debt's the total amount of money that the U.S. government owes to creditors due to spending above and beyond our tax revenues. And the amount we owe grows larger every year that we have a budget deficit. Because the budget deficit is the amount of spending within a fiscal year that's greater than the tax revenue for that year. And to get the money to spend beyond the tax revenues that are collected, it requires the government to get a loan. And the total amount of these unpaid loans from the current year and prior year budget deficits make up the national debt. Now, in a perfect world, spending never exceeds revenues. Then there aren't any budget deficits or national debt. But there are times when debt could be required, such as when tax revenues are lower than anticipated or there's unplanned spending. But it should rarely be needed in a well-run country. But our country, not so well-run anymore, needs ever-increasing amounts of debt to continue to function. How much debt are we talking about? How about $33.8 trillion of debt? And the government gets this money from just about everywhere. About $6 trillion of these loans are intergovernmental loans, where they take money from a separate government account with a surplus and loan it back to the general fund. They've done this with trillions of dollars from the Social Security Trust Fund. So some of the money in the trust fund, it really isn't there. It's already been spent on welfare or a new war, and in its place is an IOU from the government. Good luck to our retirees to ever get that money back. But the bulk of these loans, about $18 trillion, are from the sale of treasury notes and bonds to banks, investors, and foreign governments. Regular Americans also provide the government with this money when they buy a savings bond. And the other $9 trillion, where did it come from? The answer? Thin air. Really? There aren't enough people willing to invest in the ever-increasing reckless debt that's required for our government to function. The government, through the Federal Reserve, it just prints the money through a practice called quantitative easing. Remember, in spite of the misleading name, the Federal Reserve, it isn't a branch of the federal government, but rather a group of private banks. So this group of private banks, they just create the money and then they loan it to our government. And even though it's just made up money, you still have to pay it back and pay interest on it. If you think that your money's still backed by gold, it isn't. Because there isn't enough gold in the world to back up this amount of reckless spending. So aside from the obvious corruption and theft that's inherent, anytime a government can print and spend as much money as it wants, it creates other problems as well. It devalues the real money in the system. And this devaluing is the primary driver of the inflation that we have now. Large amounts of debt also create huge interest payments. And these interest payments take tax dollars. So instead of your tax dollars being used by the government for the intended purpose to operate the government, they just go to interest payments. And of course, another downside is that these large debt holdings, they compromise decision making. Because our government is beholden to creditors rather than to our country. But as bad as these consequences are, It can get worse. Because when you default on your loan, you go bankrupt and it only affects you and your creditors. But when a government default occurs, it not only affects the creditors, it destroys the value of all the money in circulation. And without the backing of gold anymore, your money is completely worthless. It's already just a piece of paper, but it becomes a worthless piece of paper when a default occurs. Your bank account, your retirement, everything other than real goods, all worthless. We've seen this repeated in many third world countries when the excessive debt required to sustain government corruption and incompetence leads to inflation, default, and then eventually bankruptcy. Now the question, has our debt always been this high? And of course, no. It's hard to believe that it was practically nothing for most of our history. In 1960, it was $286 billion, and this was leftover World War II debt. And it's gone up $33.5 trillion since then. This is about 12,000% increase in just 63 years. And it's even harder to believe since every American pays almost 50% more in taxes than they did in 1960. But the government still managed to spend all the tax money and then spend $33 trillion more. And more debt equals less future for you and your family. And they've squandered most of our future already. Today, every person in our country owes the government $100,000 due to this debt. So a family of 5 owes the government $500,000. And there's no end in sight nor a plan to correct it. Because this level of failure, it isn't a one-off or a bad year. We've run deficit spending in 62 of the last 64 years. Take a look. Our taxes have only been able to cover the government spending in 2 years since 1960. We've lost in 64 of the last 64 years, and yet, rather than learn from these failures and change course, our government's doubling down on the same failed game plan. And as a result, it gets worse every year. Just this year, it'll be an almost $2 trillion deficit, because excluding Social Security, our government will collect about $3.5 trillion in taxes, but they plan on spending $5.2 and putting us another $1.7 trillion further in debt. And we talked earlier about how the interest payments in this debt waste your tax dollars, and in the desperate position that we're in today, the interest payment alone is expected to be over $600 billion this year. That means one out of every 3 payroll taxes taken out every week will be wasted to make interest payments on this debt. Remember, a third of these interest payments, about $200 billion, are interest payments for the fictitious money that was printed out of thin air with quantitative easing. It's not even real money, but the $200 billion of interest that you pay is real money. Now some people are going to say, not my political party, we're doing the right thing, it's those other guys. So avoid this type of division and to start to bring our country together where we need to be if we're ever going to fix this problem. I color-coded the debt increase over the last 63 years by which political party was in office. First for president, and as you can see, no difference. The debt just keeps going up regardless of which party holds the presidency. Then for the majority party in the House of Representatives, same outcome. Just more failure and more debt to hide it. And then by the majority party in the Senate. And again, there's no difference. Choice is just an illusion. They're all on the same team and they're winning. But I hate to tell you, you aren't on their team and you're losing. So I hope you won't continue to be fooled into thinking that picking either one of these parties makes a difference, because the facts prove otherwise. And please don't fall for the nonsense that the government and the media will try to trick you with, such as blaming the debt on Social Security. That's a lie. We already know that the Social Security Trust Fund has a surplus and is loaned to general fund money. And Social Security is paid for with Social Security taxes that you and your employer pay into the trust fund, and not from the federal withholding taxes that you pay, which go to the general fund. Or the nonsense that our debt level is normal. It isn't. They like to fool you with this debt as a percentage of GDP figure. First of all, this figure doesn't even make sense. Think about it. Your debt limit isn't based on the size of the economy. Why should the government's? But even if you use this flawed figure, it's still not normal. In 1979, our debt to GDP ratio was 31%. That's bad, but in just 44 years, it's increased fourfold and is now the highest it's ever been at 123%. And to help put this in perspective of how bad this ratio is, I took a look at this ratio for the rest of the world. There's 169 countries in the world with calculated ratios. Where do you think we rank? We have the 161st worst ratio in the world. Yes, we're almost dead last. We're in 161st place out of 169 countries. And worse, I looked at this ratio for the countries we give foreign aid to, and believe it or not, they actually have better debt to GDP ratios than we have. Crazy. These countries are in better financial condition than we are, but to help you along in your death march, our government still takes your tax money or another loan, and gives it to these countries. When in reality, these countries should be giving us money. Look at this. Remember, we're at 123%. Egypt, 87. Ukraine's at 78. Kenya, 67. Israel, 61. Iraq, 41. Ethiopia, 31. Haiti, 25. Afghanistan, 8. I could go on, but every single country that receives foreign aid from your hard work, exception being Sudan, has a better debt to GDP ratio than we have. And the disappointments don't end there, because with our debt at $33.8 trillion, we also have the highest total debt of any country in the world. Once again, we're in last place. We're the worst in the world. This isn't the kind of American exceptionalism that I believe in. This is losing, and I'm tired of losing and tired of being in last place. I hope you are too. Let's end there for part one. When we meet next, we'll cover why we need to spend this money, where it got spent, how to fix the problems that are creating the need for this debt, and finally, the consequences if we choose to do nothing. I'll see you next time.